When I was a little boy, the preacher's name was Willis Allen. I really enjoyed him and his wife. His wife was a great alto singer, and I used to sit by her in church, and I learned to sing alto, and I learned the value of harmony from just listening to her and singing with her. She was just a wonderful lady, Lillian Allen. One day, I heard Willis Allen, the preacher, talk about the 12th chapter of Romans is full of rainy day sermons. Oh, I thought that was so great. I had no idea what a rainy day sermon was though. But I thought that was a good way to express something. Well, you fast forward just a little bit now and stop and think about the days when I was at David Lipscomb College back in the late 40s and early 50s. And there I had a course in the book of Romans under J.P. Sanders, a man that some of you knew. I remember very well when we had that course, I said, wow, this is unbelievably rich. I never saw the riches of Romans until I had that course with J.P. Sanders. Well, the 12th chapter of Romans is one of the most inspiring chapters in the entire Bible. When I was planning the sermons for October, I thought, I believe I'll take 4 sermons from sections of Romans chapter 12. So we're going to explore this thing. I doubt if you're going to do this, but I'm going to suggest it. Every day during the month of October, sit down and read the entire chapter 12 of the book of Romans. You will almost memorize it by the time you've done that. And that ain't all bad, kids. You will find in it, each time you read it, you'll find in it something you've never thought of before. You'll find something you hadn't thought of when you read it 15 times before. It's just a great and wonderful book. And it's a great and wonderful chapter. Well, the chapter begins with an important word. Therefore. Well, when you see that word, you know it's connected to what went before. And so we have to really see the book as a whole before we can really think in terms of this 12th chapter and the many wonderful gems and jewels that it has in it. So he says, therefore, in view of the mercies of God. What are you talking about, Paul? Well, the first 11 chapters of the book of Romans gives a foundation for the 12th chapter. And the first 11 chapters are very complex. They are profound, but God has a way of inspiring the writers of his word here so that we can gain great things even though we don't quite understand some of these profound things. And the more we read and the more we study, the more the profound things come to light, and we begin to learn and understand some great things that are there. And in this 12th chapter, in the first 11 chapters of the book of Romans, he talks to us about very important things. And one of those things is, hey, now you're not going to like this, but one of those things is, you can't be good enough to be saved. Well, I thought, you know, when you die, you go to heaven. If you don't believe that, the celebrities die, and if we like that celebrity, he's now looking down on us. He's from heaven. He's looking down on us as we're doing this, that, or the other. And how many times has this come about where celebrities always go to heaven if we like them? If they did nice things, if they gave away a lot of money and things like this. You know, the Bible doesn't say anything at all about the justification value of those things. Some people obey God because they're afraid not to. Oh, I'm afraid I'll go to hell if I don't obey him. Some people obey God with the same idea in mind, but it's, I want the reward of heaven. That's the reason I obey God. And then some people obey God because they love God. Well, people say, well, yes, I love God, but I want to obey God to go to heaven. Well, we're going to talk about that in a little bit, just a minute. But one of the important things about this book of Romans is that it tells us that it is not the goodness of our own lives that forgives our sins. It isn't that. It's the atonement of Christ that forgives our sins. And Paul was writing to some people who had the idea in mind, the more good I can pile up in my life, the better off I will be and the better chance I will have of going to heaven. Paul never says anything about that. But he does say, devote your lives to God. Give your life to God. The whole first 11 chapters is wrapped up in the fact that you cannot be good enough to go to heaven. Instead, you need the sacrifice of Christ. And the emphasis is not on how good I am. The emphasis is on how good Christ was to do this for me, to do this for all of us. And so the whole thing is that I'm not trying to please myself. I'm not trying to be what God wants me to be so I can go to heaven. What is it then? Well, I can never deserve heaven. I can't be that good. It's the grace of God. It's the gift of God. You know, so many times when I was growing up, when people would say something about salvation is a gift of God, boy, immediately, yes, it's conditional. It's conditional. Want to be sure that we understood it's conditional. Of course it's conditional. But the condition is not obey, 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 obey. The condition is love God, love Christ. You know, those of us who are married or have been married realize that marriages don't succeed because a husband says to his wife, I'm going to do the bare minimum. I'm going to do the bare minimum in our marriage. And the wife says to the husband, me too. I'm going to do the bare minimum. If it's not absolutely required, I'm not going to do it. Isn't that the way some people, isn't that the way some of us, isn't that the way many of us stop and think about church, God, Christ? I especially want to recommend that you really tune into the things that Nathan Scott had to say. And that is that Christ wants us to give ourselves to Him. Money, yes, that's fine. We need money. But giving ourselves to Him is what it's really all about. And when Paul wrote to the Corinthians, the second letter, in the 8th chapter of the second letter, he said, you know, the key to the people in Macedonia who were so very, very liberal in their monetary gifts to relieve the poor and all, he said, here's the key. Listen to it. First, they gave themselves. First, they gave themselves. That's what Paul is talking about in this whole thing of Romans chapters 1 through 11. Once we bring into our lives the idea of my total devotion to God, there's so many things about my obligations that just fade into oblivion. You see, when I finally came to the point that I loved this lady, Betty Patton, I loved her more than any person in the whole world, I wasn't interested in doing the bare necessities, the bare requirements. I was interested in doing everything I possibly could to express to her how much I loved her. That's the way we need to see the book of Romans, the Christian life, expressing to God all that God has blessed us with and express thanksgiving. You see, my obedience ought not to be motivated by what I want. I want heaven. I want blessings. I want answers to prayer the way I pray them. I want this, I want this, I want this. I want my life to be full. I want my life to be happy. You know, all these things together, that's all me-centered. Instead, how about let's pray, God, whatever it takes in my life, make me a servant. Make me devoted to you. Make me be willing to sacrifice in order to serve you. Sacrifice my time, my energy, my money, my status, whatever it is. God, make me a servant. Hey, listen. You probably offer thanks before you eat. Most of us do. Every time you stop to offer thanks for your food, will you say earnestly, honestly, sincerely, God, make me a servant? Or is that a little too scary? God, make me a servant. Not what I want, God, what you want me to be. That's the thing of the first 11 chapters. Gratitude and thanksgiving for the sacrifice of Christ. Gratitude and thanksgiving is such a high motivator. Trying to gain a reward, trying to get paid for what I do, is such a low motivator. And so the first 11 chapters challenges us, don't be self-centered, be God-centered. Don't be self-centered in your attitude and my attitude, in your work and my work. Don't be self-centered in reference to our relationships with other people. Be God-centered. That's what he's really talking about. You know, I wish I knew how many times I've quoted this passage to you, but here goes again. What should I say? I think I've quoted this 1,373 times. Well, this is 74. Galatians chapter 2. I want us to see the force of what Paul says. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The life that I live in this body, I live by faith in the Son of God. And here's the clincher. Faith in the Son of God who loved me, Paul says, and gave himself up for me. It was so intensely personal to Paul because Paul had gone through so many things in his sacrifice for Christ, in his knowledge of Christ. And he says, you know, if I were the only person in the whole world who would accept him, he'd have died for me. He loved me, and he gave himself up for me. Well, I don't set aside the grace of God. You see, obedience and the emphasis on obedience and the necessity of obedience, that doesn't say grace doesn't count. It says my obedience is my response to God's grace. And so he says, I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could have come through law, and by the way, there's no definite article there. He's talking about law as a basic general thing. Not just the law of Moses, any law. Righteousness does not come by law. It doesn't come by obedience. That's not what makes us righteous. Righteousness, if it had come by law, why have Christ? Paul says, Christ would have died for nothing. Now that doesn't de-emphasize the importance of obedience. It emphasizes it. It raises it to a higher level. It raises it to the level where my obedience is God-centered. My obedience is not man-centered. My obedience is not so I can mark something down, say, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. That isn't it at all. It's, God, I love you. What can I do to show you my love and devotion? So Paul is not limiting his statement to the law of Moses. Instead, he's saying, any law. The law doesn't save. Christ saves. Well, then he goes on and he says, I do not want you to be conformed to this world. Negative statement. Then a positive statement. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Well, when he makes this statement, this negative statement, he says, hey, in your culture, and he lived in a pagan culture, by the way, we kind of do too, but in your culture, in your society, in your politics, in popular opinion, there are some terribly evil things. Oh, society approves of it. If you oppose it, you're a bigot. But instead, we've got to go and find out, does God oppose it? Or does God uphold it? And so he says, don't be conformed to the world. Don't allow social mores, don't allow the culture, don't allow that to be your guide about rights and wrongs. Instead, let your guide about rights and wrongs be God. And don't give way to culture. And then he puts a positive. Be transformed. I made a little note in the sermon announcement that I mail out. Electrical engineers, many years ago, found out that if you constructed what they called a transformer, if you constructed it by winding wires around a pole and then winding wires around another pole, when they come close together, they will transform the energy, and you can take something that is low voltage and raise it to high voltage by a transformer. Or you can take something that's high voltage and transform it to low voltage. And you see these things all over the place on the telephone poles, on the light poles and things like this. Transformers. So Paul says, be transformed. Be transformed. God can take your low voltage life of misery, of disappointment, of incapability to confront life the way it really is. He can take your low voltage life and he can make it a high voltage life. He can make it something beautiful and something wonderful. He can take your sorrows and turn them into gladness. He can take your failures and help you to see how to confront them and how to conquer them. He can take your disappointments and he can bring them to wondrous, glorious, fine accomplishments. Be transformed. By the way, you notice as I read this, it says, be transformed, which is in the passive voice. He didn't say transform yourselves. He says, be transformed. God is the one that transforms us, but he has to have our consent. We have to say yes. Saying yes is one of the most dangerous things you can say. Because when God said, serve me, you say yes. Do you serve him? When God says, worship me, you say yes. Do you worship him? When God says, sacrifice for me, yes. Am I sacrificing for him? So, in order to be transformed, we have to consent to it. Be transformed. How, Paul? I wish I knew how. How do I get this transformation? By the renewing of your mind. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. God will renew your mind if you will let Him. God will renew my mind if I will let Him, but I've got to open the door to Him. I've got to allow Him to come in and renew my mind. He doesn't knock the door down. He asked me to open it from the inside. Well, you know, for the life of me, I cannot express this. I can't really define this renewal of your mind, that you may prove what is the good and perfect and acceptable will of God, and all of this. I just can't do it. And so while I was thinking on this and preparing this lesson, I remembered an incident out of my boyhood. Here I go again, talking about my boyhood. In the house where I grew up, we had 5 mango trees, Hayden mangoes, very best mangoes anywhere around. Hayden mangoes. Oh, I loved Hayden mangoes. And there was an adult, a man, talking to me one time. I was talking about how good Hayden mangoes were. He says, Jack, how good are they? What do they taste like? He'd never tasted one. I said, well, let me see, what does that thing taste like? Well, I finally said this. I said, you know how good a really good peach tastes? I like peaches. You know how good a real good peach tastes? Yeah. Well, a Hayden mango is at least 5 times better than that. Folks, that didn't accomplish a thing in the world. The point is this. If you've never tasted a Hayden mango, nobody can explain to you how it tastes, how wonderful it is. Nobody can explain to you any of those things, but instead, you got to taste it. You got to experience it yourself. That's the only way that you can understand the Hayden mango. And I think Paul is saying the same thing here about this renewal of your mind. I can't express that. I can't define that. I can't analyze that. I can't tell you it works this way. But I can tell you this. Once you have experienced it, allowed God to come into your life, allowed God to come into my life, once we have experienced this, then it changes us. We become different kind of people. We're not after this one. We're not disgusted with that. We're not going to quit because of this. But instead, our minds are changed. Our minds are renewed. Wait a minute. There's an interesting passage in the Psalms that tells us something about this. I don't know if you ever read this or not. Maybe you've heard it. The 34th Psalm, the psalmist says, taste and see that the Lord is good. Taste and see that the Lord is good. I think the psalmist had in mind the same thing I just finished mentioning. I can't tell you how good it is that He is. I can't express this to you in any effective way. I can't define it. You got to taste it. You got to taste it. So to use a rather crude expression now, maybe we need to take a bite out of God and taste and see what it's really like. Amen. So he says, taste and see that the Lord is good. Let's see if we can see. Let's see if we can experience just how God can be in the lives of each one of us. How does this take place? Well, he tells us exactly how it takes place. He doesn't tell us the how of the workings of it, but he tells us a step that we must take. And it's right there in that second verse. And in the second verse he says, by the renewing of your mind, present your bodies living sacrifice to God. Present your body as a living sacrifice. That's the way this whole thing comes about. That's the way we learn to taste God, to see what is so wonderful in this new relationship that we have. So that now, instead of being self-centered, I can be God-centered, can't I? Instead of what's good for me, it's how can I express my gratitude to God. How do I do it? Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Is it required? Can I get by without it? Well, sweetheart, I'm only going to do in our marriage what is absolutely required. I'm only going to do in our marriage what is absolutely required too. That marriage goes down the drain. Instead, it's the maximum. What more can I do to show you my love, God? What more can I do to show you my devotion, God? What more can I do that will show you the depth of my profound gratitude for the sacrifice of Christ? How? By giving myself, my body, to you. Well, I can't give you a description of just exactly how all of this works. But there's something else that he says in this second verse. He says, which is your spiritual act of worship. Now that really, for us, that really is not a very good translation. Yes, the word means an act of worship, but it doesn't mean an act of worship as a substitute for praise and prayer and song and Lord's Supper and those things that we do corporately. There are two different words that are used in the New Testament for this. And one of those words is this spiritual act. Now, the word originally meant a spiritual act of service to your God. The Greeks would have said, any God you want to. But it's your spiritual act of service to your God. And then this came to mean that if you're spiritually acting to serve your God, you are in a sense glorifying God. And so finally the idea came that your life is an act of worship. And that's true. Our lives are the way we glorify God every day. Our lives are the way that we glorify God in the marketplace, at work, in the family, in the community. This service to one another. That's the way we serve God. We can't serve God unless we're willing to serve people. That really is what Jesus had in mind when Jesus, he gave us the scene of the Last Judgment. And he said, I was sick and you came to me. I was in prison, you came to me. I was hungry and you fed me, and so forth. And so the king will say, come, you blessed of my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. Well, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I was in need of clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. And then they're going to say, whoa, wait a minute. When did we see you like this? Here's the answer. The king replied, I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of the least of these, what's the rest of that now? You did it unto me. We serve God by serving people. This is a part of the mercies of God. This is a part of the character of God, is to say to us, serve people, serve the church, serve people who are out of Christ. Serve people. That's one way that you serve me. Well, this transformation then comes about when we open ourselves to serve God by serving people. When we open ourselves to serve God by serving the congregation. When we open ourselves to serve God by devoted service to others. Well, He'll transform us then. I wrote these few things down. The Lord himself transforms us. He cures our broken spirit. He soothes our troubled heart. He repairs and heals our distressed and wounded soul. He takes the weakened spirit and he recharges it with the dynamism of hope and joy and peace. He takes a broken life and revives it so that it can become vibrant and responsive as it once was to God. If you're not a Christian today, don't miss the wonderful blessings of service to him. Don't miss the wonderful blessings of hope, of joy, of peace. Don't miss the wonderful blessings that he has promised. If you learn to trust not in yourself, but in the sacrifice of Christ. If you are in any way subject to the invitation of Christ, we invite you to come. Let's stand together and sing.